Every man deserves a second chance, even when the world has written him off completely. Frank Delaney learned this truth the hard way, spending 11 winters alone in the Montana wilderness after losing everything he once held dear. The 58-year-old former carpenter built his shelter from salvaged plywood, hidden among towering pines where no badge or judgment could reach him. He chose this exile after his life fell apart, finding peace in the silence of forgotten places. But on this February morning, as ice turns mountain roads into death traps, Frank's solitude is shattered by twisted metal and a dying engine. Officer Darren Pike wakes up upside down in a snowbank, blood trickling down his forehead, staring at the weathered face of a man he arrested 3 years ago. What happens when the person society forgot becomes the only hope for survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning routine never changed. Frank Delaney rose with the first pale light filtering through the pine canopy, his internal clock calibrated to the mountain's rhythm after 11 years of wilderness living. He emerged from his shelter, a carefully constructed lean-to built against a massive boulder, reinforced with salvaged plywood and insulated with layers of pine boughs and old sleeping bags. The structure was invisible from any trail, tucked into a natural depression where granite met earth in perfect concealment. His breath formed white clouds in the February air as he knelt beside the small fire pit, stirring yesterday's embers back to life with practiced efficiency. The kindling caught quickly, flames dancing upward through progressively larger pieces of deadwood he'd gathered and seasoned over months. Beside the fire pit sat his most treasured possession, a weathered red toolbox that had once belonged. In the back of his pickup truck, back when he had a truck, back when he had a business, back when Frank Delaney was someone people called when they needed quality carpentry work done right. He opened the toolbox with reverent care, running calloused fingers over tools that still gleamed despite their age. A hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth by decades of use. Chisels sharp enough to shave curls from pine. A level that had helped him build countless homes for other families. Each tool carried the weight of memory. Jobs completed, satisfied customers, the pride of craftsmanship that had once defined his identity. Frank had been the kind of carpenter people sought out specifically, the one whose work lasted generations. In Glacier Falls, Montana, his reputation preceded him into every lumber yard and hardware store. Folks would point to houses around town and say, "Frank Delaney built that kitchen," or "Those cabinets? That's Frank's work." He took pride in joints that fit perfectly without nails, in measurements precise to the 16th of an inch, in finishes that revealed the natural beauty of the wood grain. The toolbox also held his wedding ring, a simple gold band he'd removed from his finger the day they lowered Mary into the frozen ground. She'd been gone 3 years now, cancer taking her piece by piece while Frank watched helplessly, spending their savings on treatments that bought time, but not hope. Mary had been his anchor, the reason he built their small house with extra care, crafting built-in bookcases she filled with romance novels, constructing a kitchen island where she taught their neighbors' children to bake cookies. After Mary died, the work dried up, not from lack of skill, but from lack of heart. Frank would start a project and find himself staring at the wood, seeing Mary's face in the grain, hearing her laugh echo in the sound of his saw. Jobs went unfinished. Customers grew frustrated. Word spread in a small town, the way word always does. Frank Delaney wasn't reliable anymore. The debts piled up like snow in a hard winter. Medical bills, mortgage payments, business loans taken to keep the shop running during Mary's illness. The house went first, then the shop, then the truck with his company name painted on the door. Frank found himself sleeping in a motel room, then in his car, then finally walking into these mountains with nothing but the clothes on his back and the toolbox in his hands. That had been 11 years ago, when Frank was 47 and still believed life might offer him another chance. Now he understood that some men aren't meant for second acts. Some men are meant to disappear into the wilderness and find whatever peace they can in solitude. He pulled a small pine cross from the toolbox, carved during his first winter when the loneliness threatened to break him. He'd whittled it from a piece of deadfall, working by firelight when sleep wouldn't come, his hands needing the familiar motion of shaping wood. The cross wasn't perfect. One arm slightly longer than the other, the surface bearing the marks of a knife instead of sandpaper. But it represented something important. Not faith exactly, but the possibility that even broken things could have purpose. Frank's morning ritual continued with checking his snares, following paths worn by years of repetition through dense underbrush. He'd learned to read the forest's signs, which trees the deer favored for shelter, where small game traveled between, water and food, how to predict weather changes by watching bird behavior. Survival in the Montana wilderness required patience and observation, skills that transferred naturally from his carpenter days when reading wood grain meant the difference between a joint that held and one that failed. His snares yielded a single rabbit, enough protein for 2 days if stretched properly. Frank had learned to waste nothing, to honor the life that sustained his own by using every part of what the forest provided. He cleaned the rabbit with a knife kept sharp on a whetstone, saving the pelt for winter repairs to his clothing, setting aside bones that would become tools or fishing hooks. The sound of an engine struggling against ice made Frank pause, his knife still in his hands. The old logging road ran about a quarter-mile from his camp, abandoned by the Forestry Service but still used occasionally by hunters or lost tourists. Frank had learned to recognize the different sounds. Pickup trucks grinding slowly through snow, motorcycles racing in summer, the occasional ranger vehicle checking for illegal camping. This sound was different, urgent. The engine revved high, then cut to nothing, followed by the unmistakable crash of metal against trees. Frank stood motionless, listening. In 11 years, he'd heard plenty of accidents on that road, mostly minor fender benders when summer tourists took curves too fast or winter ice sent vehicles sliding into ditches. His policy was simple: stay hidden, let others handle the problems of the world he'd left behind. Getting involved meant answering questions, showing identification he no longer possessed, facing the possibility of recognition. But the silence that followed the crash felt wrong. No voices calling for help, no car doors slamming, no sounds of people checking for damage. Just the morning wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Frank closed the toolbox and secured his camp. Habits ingrained by years of careful survival. He moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged there, placing each step deliberately to avoid breaking branches or disturbing snow that might reveal his passage. The crash site appeared through the trees like a violent interruption of the mountain's peace. A Glacier Falls Police Department patrol car lay on its side against a massive pine tree, steam rising from a cracked radiator, glass scattered across snow, stained with antifreeze and oil. The vehicle's roof was partially crushed, and through the spider-webbed windshield, Frank could see a figure slumped against the steering wheel. His first instinct was to retreat, to melt back into the forest and pretend he'd never seen anything. Police meant questions, investigations, background checks. Police meant people digging into Frank Delaney's past, discovering his current living situation, forcing him back into a world that had already cast him aside. But the figure in the car wasn't moving, and Frank had seen enough death to recognize when someone needed immediate help. He approached the wreck carefully, boots crunching through snow, and peered through the shattered driver's side window. Officer Darren Pike lay unconscious, his face pale except for the blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. Frank recognized him immediately, the same rigid posture, the same granite jawline, the same cold eyes that had looked at Frank with such disdain 3 years ago outside Murphy's bar. Pike had been the arresting officer the night Frank's world finally collapsed completely, the night he'd been caught sleeping behind the hardware store in a cardboard shelter, charged with vagrancy and public intoxication. Frank remembered Pike's voice that night, sharp with authority and disgust. "You can't sleep here, pal. This is private property, and you're disturbing the peace." No attempt to understand Frank's situation, no recognition that a man reduced to sleeping behind a store might need help rather than arrest. Just the cold machinery of law enforcement processing another problem. Now Pike was the one who needed help, trapped in twisted metal with blood on his face, and no one else for miles around. Frank could walk away, should walk away, let someone else find the wreck. Let Pike face his own survival crisis without intervention from a man he'd treated like garbage. Instead, Frank found himself testing the car door, finding it jammed against the tree, moving around to check other entry points. Pike's radio crackled with static, the dashboard lights flickering as the electrical system slowly died. No cell. Phone signal this far into the mountains, no way to call for backup or emergency services. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. The officer who'd once arrested him for having nowhere to sleep now depended entirely on Frank's knowledge of how to survive in the wilderness when civilization's safety nets failed. Frank circled the overturned patrol car like a craftsman examining a challenging project, looking for the best angle of approach. The vehicle had rolled during impact, coming to rest against the pine tree with the driver's side facing up. Pike remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady, blood from the head wound creating dark spots on his uniform collar. "I'm gonna pull you out," Frank called through the broken window, though he doubted Pike could hear him. The words felt strange in his throat. He hadn't spoken to another human being in months, and these might be the first words he'd ever spoken to Pike that weren't filtered through the formal language of arrest and booking. The passenger door was accessible but dented, requiring Frank to use a rock as a makeshift hammer to pound the frame back into alignment. The metal groaned in protest before finally yielding, the door swinging open with a sharp screech that sent a pair of ravens cawing from nearby branches. Pike stirred at the sound, his eyes fluttering open with the unfocused confusion of concussion. He tried to turn his head toward the noise and immediately winced, pain creasing his features. "What? Where?" His voice came out as a croak, dry and disoriented. "Easy there, officer," Frank said, climbing into the car's interior, now oriented. "Sideways like a funhouse attraction. You've been in an accident. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay still while I check for injuries." Pike's eyes focused on Frank's face with growing recognition and alarm. "You." The single word carried accusation, suspicion, and the reflexive authority of a man accustomed to being in control. Frank Delaney. That's right. Frank kept his voice steady, professional, the way he used to talk to clients when explaining why a job would take longer than expected. "Right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is getting you stable and warm before this weather gets worse." Pike tried to sit up straighter, a motion that sent him back against the seat with a sharp intake of breath. "My radio. Need to call for backup. Radio's dead. So's your cell phone, most likely." Frank gestured toward the dashboard, where warning lights blinked erratically around spider-webbed gauges. "We're about 5 miles from the main road, and the storm they've been forecasting is moving in faster than predicted." Through the cracked windshield, they could see snow beginning to fall in earnest, fat flakes that would soon reduce visibility to mere yards. The wind was picking up too, carrying the promise of the kind of mountain storm that could dump 2 feet of snow in a matter of hours. Pike's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, then stopped when he realized the futility of the gesture. Frank wasn't threatening him, wasn't even standing close enough to be considered menacing. Just a weathered man in layers of practical winter clothing, examining Pike's injuries with the competence of someone who'd learned basic field medicine through necessity. "You've got a concussion," Frank continued, ignoring Pike's defensive posturing. "Probably mild, but head injuries are tricky. That cut on your forehead needs cleaning and bandaging. Your left wrist looks sprained, maybe fractured. You're favoring it without realizing it. Can you feel your feet?" Pike tested his extremities carefully, his face betraying relief when everything responded properly. "I think so. Everything seems to work." "Good. That means we're dealing with bumps and bruises instead of spinal injuries. I'm going to help you out of this car and get you somewhere warm and dry. After that, we'll figure out how to get you proper medical attention." "I don't need your help," Pike said automatically, though his attempt to climb out of the wreckage under his own power ended quickly when dizziness forced him back against the seat. "I can manage." Frank studied Pike with the patience of a man who'd learned to read wood grain for stress fractures, recognizing when something looked solid on the surface but couldn't bear weight. "Officer Pike, with respect, you're in no condition to manage anything right now. You can't stand without falling over. You're bleeding, and there's a storm coming that's going to turn this area into a frozen wasteland for the next few days. Your choice is simple: accept help from me or die of exposure waiting for rescue that isn't coming." The bluntness of Frank's assessment cut through Pike's reflexive authority, forcing him to confront the reality of his situation. He was injured, alone, and completely dependent on a man he'd arrested for vagrancy 3 years ago. The irony was thick enough to taste. Pike's police badge caught the grey light filtering through snow clouds, the metal tarnished from years of wear. It had always been his symbol of authority, the thing that gave his words weight and his presence power. Now it felt like costume jewelry, meaningless metal in a situation where survival skills mattered more than legal authority. "Why would you?" "Help me?" Pike asked finally, genuine confusion replacing his defensive bluster. "After what happened between us, because it's the right thing to do," Frank interrupted. "And because whether you believe it or not, I'm still the same man I was before life knocked me down. Bad circumstances don't erase good character, just like good circumstances don't create it." Frank reached into the car and carefully helped. Pike maneuvered toward the open door, supporting his weight as they navigated the awkward transition from the tilted interior to solid ground. Pike's legs were unsteady, requiring Frank's strong grip to prevent a fall that could worsen his injuries. "My gear," Pike mumbled, looking back at the wreckage. "Evidence kit, emergency supplies. I'll come back for what we can use," Frank assured him. "Right now, the priority is getting you to shelter before this storm gets serious." The snow was falling harder now, the kind of heavy, wet flakes that would accumulate quickly and make travel impossible. Frank could read the weather signs like a carpenter reading blueprints, the way the wind shifted direction, the particular quality of light that preceded heavy snowfall, the behavior of small animals seeking deeper shelter. Pike leaned heavily against Frank as they began the quarter-mile trek to Frank's camp, every step requiring careful negotiation over uneven terrain made treacherous by fresh snow. Frank matched his pace to Pike's limitations, providing steady support without comment. "Or complaint. This is crazy," Pike muttered, more to himself than to Frank. "I should be calling this in, getting medical attention, filing a report." "You should be grateful you're alive," Frank replied mildly. "Everything else can wait until we get through the next few days." They moved through the forest in awkward tandem, Frank's wilderness experience guiding them along paths invisible to Pike's untrained eye. The sound of their passage was muffled by falling snow, creating an intimacy of shared vulnerability that neither man acknowledged aloud. Pike's training had prepared him for many emergency situations, but none that required depending on a suspect. He'd once arrested. Frank's experience had taught him to help anyone in genuine need, regardless of past conflicts or personal feelings. The intersection of their histories created a tension that would either bind them together or tear them apart in the days ahead. As Frank's hidden camp came into view through the snow-laden pines, Pike realized he was about to become completely dependent on a man society had written off as worthless. The recognition burned in his throat like smoke from a dying fire, bitter with the taste of forced humility and unwanted insight into the gap between judgment and justice. Frank's shelter surprised Pike with its thoughtful construction and obvious permanence, What he'd expected to find was the kind of ramshackle lean-to that fit his mental image of vagrant camps, tarps stretched between trees, cardboard walls, the desperate improvisation of someone merely surviving. Instead, Pike found himself looking at something that resembled a small cabin, built with the precision of professional craftsmanship. The structure was tucked against a massive granite boulder that formed the back wall, with 3 sides constructed from salvaged plywood and 2x4s fitted together with traditional joinery. A metal chimney pipe extended through a carefully sealed roof, and the whole structure was camouflaged with pine boughs that made it nearly invisible from more than 20 feet away. "You built this?" Pike asked, unable to keep the admiration from his voice as Frank helped him through the low doorway. "Took most of my first winter," Frank replied, guiding Pike to a camp chair positioned near a small wood stove that radiated welcome heat. "Had to work with materials I could carry in, tools I could keep sharp without electricity. Different kind of carpentry than I was used to, but the principles are the same." The interior was spartanly furnished, but meticulously organized. A narrow bed frame made from pine logs supported a mattress fashioned from layers of sleeping bags and blankets. Shelves built into the walls held books, cooking supplies, and various tools and equipment. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose, and nothing was wasted. Pike settled into the chair with obvious relief, the warmth beginning to penetrate his chilled body. Frank moved efficiently around the small space, lighting a propane lantern and pulling first aid supplies from a plastic storage container. "Let me take a look at that head wound," he said, approaching Pike with a clean cloth and a bottle of water. "I'm fine," Pike said automatically, though he made no move to resist when Frank began gently cleaning the blood from his forehead. The cut was deeper than it had first appeared, requiring several butterfly bandages to close properly. "Concussion. And protocol says we need to keep you awake for the next few hours," Frank explained as he worked. "Monitor your pupils, watch for signs of brain swelling or internal bleeding. I know it's not the same as having a doctor look at you, but it's better than nothing." Pike studied Frank's face as he worked, noting the careful precision of his movements, the gentle competence of his touch. This wasn't the broken drunk he remembered from their encounter 3 years ago. Or maybe it was, but Pike was seeing aspects he'd missed the first time. "How do you know about concussion treatment?" Pike asked. "Picked up a lot of things over the years. Used to read everything I could get my hands on when I had access to libraries. Medical texts, survival manuals, anything that might help me stay alive out here." Frank stepped back to examine his handiwork. "That should hold until we can get you to proper medical care." Pike's radio, which Frank had retrieved from the patrol car, crackled with static from its position on the nearby shelf. Dispatcher calls came through in fragments, broken by interference and distance. Pike could make out references to his patrol route, missed check-ins, and growing concern about his whereabouts. "They'll be looking for me," Pike said, gesturing toward the radio. "When I don't report in, they'll send search teams." "Maybe," Frank agreed. "But this storm is going to make aerial search impossible, and ground teams won't be able to reach this area until the roads are clear. Could be days before anyone finds that patrol car, longer before they think to look this far from the crash site." The reality of their situation settled over Pike, like the cold that Frank's stove was slowly pushing back. He was injured, isolated, and completely dependent on a man he'd treated with casual cruelty during their previous encounter. The role reversal was uncomfortable enough. The growing realization that Frank was far more capable than Pike had ever imagined made it worse. Frank pulled a small tin box from a shelf and opened it carefully, revealing a simple gold wedding band nestled in cotton padding. He held the ring for a moment, running his thumb over the worn metal before closing the box and returning it to its place. "Your wife?" Pike asked, recognizing the gesture of someone handling a treasured memory. "Mary," Frank said simply. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." Pike felt an unexpected pang of recognition. He'd lost his own wife to cancer 8 years earlier, though his grief had taken a different form. throwing himself into work, building walls around his emotions, becoming the kind of rigid, by-the-book officer who saw the world in terms of black and white, guilty and innocent, deserving and undeserving. "I'm sorry," Pike said and meant it. Frank nodded acknowledgement, then moved to the stove to add more wood. "What about you? Family?" Pike hesitated, unused to personal questions from someone he'd arrested. "Divorced. Have a daughter, but we don't talk much." "That's hard," Frank said without judgment. "Family relationships are probably the most complicated carpentry project there is. You think you've got everything measured right, then discover you used the wrong kind of joints, or the wood moved after you cut it, or your foundation wasn't as solid as you thought." The metaphor struck Pike as unexpectedly profound. Coming from a man he'd dismissed as a vagrant and a drunk. "Is that why you ended up here? Problems with the foundation?" Frank considered the question while adjusting the stove damper, regulating the fire's intensity with practiced precision. "Partly. When Mary got sick, I spent everything trying to save her. Mortgaged the house, borrowed against the business, cashed in every favor I had. When she died anyway, the whole structure collapsed. Lost the house, lost the shop, lost my reputation when I couldn't complete jobs I'd already been paid for. So you just walked away." "I tried staying, tried rebuilding," Frank said. "But everywhere I looked, I saw her face. Every job reminded me of houses we'd planned to build together, dreams we'd shared. The grief was so heavy, I couldn't lift a hammer without feeling like I was going to break." Pike understood that kind of weight, the way loss could make familiar tasks feel impossible. After his divorce, he'd thrown himself into police work with renewed intensity, using the structure and authority of his job to create meaning where his personal life had failed. Frank had chosen the opposite path, walking away from everything, to find peace in solitude. "The night you arrested me," Frank continued, "I'd been drinking at Murphy's, trying to work up the courage to call my brother in Denver, ask if I could stay with him until I got back on my feet. But I knew he'd see me as a failure, someone who couldn't handle his own problems, so I drank until the bar closed, then curled up behind the hardware store because I couldn't face another night in my car." Pike remembered that night differently. A routine call about a vagrant, standard paperwork, another problem processed through the legal system. He hadn't thought about Frank Delaney once after completing the arrest report. The storm outside Frank's shelter intensified as evening approached, wind howling through the pine canopy with a voice that spoke of serious weather moving in. Frank checked the weather radio periodically, hearing reports of road closures and travel advisories that confirmed his assessment of their situation. They were effectively cut off from civilization until the storm passed and cleanup crews could reopen the mountain roads. Pike watched Frank move around the small space with economical efficiency, preparing a simple meal from canned goods and dried supplies. Every action was deliberate, nothing wasted, each resource carefully conserved. It was the behavior of someone who understood that survival depended on making smart decisions about limited assets. "You've got a system for everything," Pike observed, noting how Frank organized their meal preparation like a military operation. "Had to learn," Frank replied, opening a can of soup and adding it to a pot of water warming on the stove. "First winter nearly killed me. I was still thinking like someone who could drive to the grocery store when supplies ran low, call for help when equipment broke, rely on other people to solve problems I couldn't handle myself." Frank pulled a battered enamel cup from a shelf and examined it carefully before setting it aside for Pike's use. The cup was dented and stained, but meticulously clean, representing the kind of simple dignity that maintained humanity even in harsh circumstances. "What changed?" Pike asked. "Reality," Frank said simply. "February of my first year, I got food poisoning from a can of meat that had gone bad, spent 3 days too sick to maintain the fire, too weak to melt snow for drinking water. Came closer to dying than I'd ever been, including 2 tours in Afghanistan." Pike's eyebrows rose. "You're military?" "Combat engineer." Did 2 deployments in the early 2000s, came back and used my GI benefits to learn carpentry. Frank stirred the soup with mechanical precision. Army taught me how to build things under pressure, how to solve problems with limited resources. Those skills came in handy when civilian life fell apart. The revelation added another layer to Pike's growing reassessment of the man he'd arrested 3 years ago. Military service, skilled trade, marriage, home ownership. Frank's background included all the markers of a productive, contributing citizen. His current circumstances weren't the result of character flaws or poor choices, but of a series of losses that could have destroyed anyone. After Mary died, Frank continued, I kept thinking about something my commanding officer used to say. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to what happens to you. Took me a while to figure out what that meant in civilian terms. Pike accepted the cup of soup Frank handed him, noting the careful way Frank portioned their shared meal to ensure equal distribution. Even in scarcity, Frank maintained the kind of fairness that spoke to deeply held principles. How do you respond? You to losing everything, Pike asked. You decide what really matters, Frank said, settling into his own chair with a cup of soup. Turns out, most of what I thought I needed was just stuff. The house, the truck, the business reputation, those were nice to have, but they weren't who I was. What mattered was whether I could still build something useful, still help people when they needed help, still maintain my integrity when everything else was gone. Pike tasted the soup. Simple vegetable broth, but perfectly seasoned and satisfying. After the day's ordeals, Frank had somehow made a basic survival meal feel like hospitality. Is that why you pulled me out of the car? Pike asked. To maintain your integrity. Frank considered the question while eating, taking time to think before responding. Partly, but also because I remembered what it felt like to be written off. To have people look at me and see only what was wrong instead of what was salvageable. You never looked at me that way exactly, but you didn't look very deep either. The criticism was delivered without malice, just the calm assessment of someone who'd learned to see situations clearly. Pike felt the truth of it like a physical weight, recognizing his own tendency to categorize people based on surface appearances and immediate circumstances. You're right, Pike admitted. I saw a drunk vagrant behind a store, processed the situation according to protocol, and moved. On to the next call. I never thought about what might have led you there. Most people don't, Frank said without bitterness. It's easier to assume that people in bad situations deserve what they get, that poverty and homelessness are character flaws, instead of circumstances, makes it simpler to sleep at night when you don't have to think about how thin the line is between stability and disaster. Pike's radio crackled with another dispatch, this one announcing the suspension of search operations due to weather conditions. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm, but Pike could hear the underlying concern for an officer who'd missed multiple check-ins and couldn't be reached. They're worried about you, Frank observed. Good team, Pike said. We look out for each other. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Though I have to admit, this isn't how I imagine spending the next few days. Could be worse, Frank pointed out. Could be spending them alone in a crashed car, slowly freezing to death. Pike acknowledged the truth of that with a rueful smile. Fair point. I guess I owe you more than I can repay. You don't owe me anything, Frank said firmly. This is just people helping people, the way it's supposed to work when everything else gets stripped away. Outside, the wind reached a new level of intensity, rattling the shelter's walls and sending snow swirling past the single window. Frank checked the stove and added more wood, maintaining the careful balance between warmth and fuel conservation that would keep them comfortable through the long night ahead. Pike watched Frank's methodical preparation for sleep, banking the fire, securing loose items, checking the integrity of their shelter against the storm's assault. Every action demonstrated hard-won expertise in survival skills that Pike had never needed to develop. Frank, Pike said, as they prepared to settle in for the night, I want you to know that arrest 3 years ago. I wish I'd handled it differently." Frank looked at him across the flickering light of the lantern, his expression thoughtful but not surprised. "We all make decisions based on the information we have at the time. Can't change the past, but we can learn from it." The response was gracious without being dismissive, acknowledging Pike's regret while refusing to dwell on old grievances. It was the kind of wisdom that came from facing harder losses than wounded pride or professional embarrassment. Pike woke to the sound of Frank moving quietly around the shelter, stoking the fire and preparing coffee in a dented aluminum pot. Grey morning light filtered through the window, revealing a world transformed by the night's snowfall. 3 feet of fresh powder had accumulated against the shelter walls, and snow continued to fall in steady, heavy flakes that promised at least another day of isolation. "How's the head?" Frank asked, noting Pike's careful movements as he sat up. Pike tested his balance, pleased to find the dizziness had largely subsided. "Better. The headache's manageable and everything seems to be working properly. Good sign. Concussion symptoms usually peak in the first 24 hours. Frank handed Pike a cup of coffee, black and strong, brewed from grounds he'd been rationing carefully. "We're going to be here at least another day, maybe 2. Storm's not finished, and even when it stops, the roads won't be passable for a while." Pike accepted this assessment without argument, having learned to trust Frank's reading of wilderness conditions. Through the window, he could see the continuing snowfall had rendered the forest nearly unrecognizable, transforming familiar shapes into alien contours of white. "Tell me about that night," Frank said, settling into his chair with his own cup of coffee. "The arrest, what you saw, what you were thinking." Pike was surprised by the directness of the question, but recognized it as a fair request given their circumstances. "Routine call. Business owner reported someone sleeping behind his store, wanted police to move them along. I expected to find someone who'd wandered off from one of the shelters in town, maybe issue a warning and give them directions to services. But that's not what you found." "No." Pike stared into his coffee, remembering. "I found a man in a business suit, sleeping in a cardboard shelter he'd constructed with obvious skill. You smelled like alcohol, but you weren't stumbling drunk. When I woke you up, you were polite, cooperative, almost apologetic. It didn't fit the profile I was expecting." Frank's leather-bound journal lay open on the nearby shelf, filled with observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and survival techniques developed through years of wilderness living. The neat handwriting and careful illustrations spoke to a mind that remained sharp and curious despite the isolation. "What did you think?" Frank asked. "Honestly, I thought you were probably mentally ill. Someone who'd had a breakdown, lost touch with reality, ended up on the streets because you couldn't take care of yourself." Pike met Frank's eyes directly. "I processed you according to standard procedures. Vagrancy, public intoxication, disturbing. The piece figured the system would sort out whatever services you needed. Did you wonder about my story?" Pike considered the question carefully. "Not really. I was focused on clearing the call, documenting the arrest, moving on to the next situation. We handle a lot of homeless cases, and after a while, you stop thinking about each one individually. They become statistics, problems to be processed rather than people with histories." Frank nodded, showing no offense at Pike's honesty. "What would you have done differently knowing what you know now?" Asked more questions, tried to understand. "How you ended up there instead of just dealing with the immediate situation. Maybe looked for alternatives to arrest, ways to connect you with resources that might have helped instead of criminalizing your circumstances." "There weren't any resources," Frank pointed out gently. "The shelters were full, the social services were overwhelmed, and the local programs weren't designed for someone like me, temporary housing for people between homes, not for someone whose whole life had collapsed." Pike realized this was true. Glacier Falls had limited resources for homeless individuals, and most were designed for short-term emergency assistance rather than comprehensive support for people facing complete life reconstruction. The system, isn't set up for someone like you, Pike admitted. Someone with skills and education who just got hit by circumstances beyond their control. We treat homelessness like it's always the result of addiction or mental illness, but that's not always the case. Frank stirred the fire, watching flames dance around fresh pieces of kindling. After Mary died, I went to the county social services office, sat in a waiting room for 3 hours to talk to a caseworker who had 15 minutes and a checklist of programs I didn't qualify for. Too educated for job training, too healthy for disability assistance, too old for youth programs, not addicted enough for treatment services. What did they offer? Emergency shelter for 3 days, food stamps if I could provide a permanent address, and a list of churches that served meals on different days of the week. Frank's voice carried no bitterness, just the flat recitation of facts. The caseworker was nice enough, but she was dealing with a system designed for different problems than mine. Pike had encountered that same system from the law enforcement side, watching officers cycle the same individuals through arrests and releases without addressing underlying issues. It was easier to blame the people than examine the gaps in services. So, you decided to disappear instead. I decided to stop being a burden on a system that couldn't help me anyway, Frank corrected. Out here, I take care of my own needs, solve my own problems, don't require services or resources that could go to someone else. Pike studied Frank's journal, noting entries that tracked weather patterns over multiple years, documented seasonal changes in animal behavior, recorded successful and failed survival strategies. It was the work of someone who approached problems, systematically learned from experience, and adapted to changing circumstances. Don't you get lonely? Pike asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave to all decisions. Sometimes, especially the first few years when I'd catch myself starting conversations with people who weren't there, or when I'd see something beautiful and want to share it with Mary. What do you do when that happens? I remember that loneliness is temporary, but bad decisions last forever. I came out here to heal, not to punish myself. There's a difference between solitude and isolation. One is a choice, the other is a sentence. Pike found himself thinking about his own isolation, the emotional walls he'd built after his divorce, the way he'd used police work to avoid dealing with personal relationships that required vulnerability and trust. His isolation was self-imposed too, but unlike Frank's, it hadn't brought him peace. How do you know the difference? Solitude gives you space to think clearly, to understand yourself without other people's expectations getting in the way. Isolation cuts you off from everything, including the parts of yourself that need connection to survive. Frank poured more coffee for both of them, the mundane gesture somehow profound in the context of their conversation. I chose solitude because I needed to figure out who Frank Delaney was when everything else got stripped away. What I found was someone I could respect, even if the rest of the world had written him off. Pike realized he envied that clarity, that sense of self-knowledge achieved through deliberate reflection. His own identity had become so intertwined with his role as a police officer that he wasn't sure who Darren Pike was when the badge came off. "What about you?" Frank asked. "Who is Darren Pike when he's not being Officer Pike?" The question caught Pike off guard, partly because it was so direct, and partly because he didn't have a ready answer. "I'm not sure I know anymore. Work takes up most of my time and energy. When I'm off duty, I mostly just—" He paused, realizing how empty his personal life had become. "I mostly just wait to go back to work." "That's not sustainable," Frank observed. "A job is what you do, not who you are. When you confuse the two, losing the job means losing yourself." Pike thought about his colleagues who'd retired and struggled with depression, who'd built their entire identities around being police officers and didn't know how to be anything else. He was headed down the same path, using authority and duty to avoid confronting deeper questions about purpose and meaning. My ex-wife used to say I loved the job more than I loved her, Pike said. I always argued that wasn't true, but maybe she was right. Maybe I loved what the job let me avoid more than what it let me accomplish. The afternoon brought a temporary lull in the snowfall, though the sky remained heavy with the promise of more weather to come. Frank used the respite to check his snares and gather additional firewood, inviting Pike to accompany him, despite the officer's still tender condition. Movement will help prevent stiffness, Frank explained, helping Pike into an extra coat he'd improvised from layered wool blankets. And you need to understand our situation if something happens to me. They moved through the forest slowly, Frank pointing out landmarks and explaining the logic behind his camp's location. Pike found himself impressed by the complexity of Frank's wilderness infrastructure. Not just the shelter, but an entire system of food procurement, water collection and resource management that enabled long-term survival. You've built a whole life out here, Pike observed, watching Frank check a snare that had yielded a small grouse. Had to. The alternative was dying, and I wasn't ready for that. Frank reset the snare with practiced efficiency. First year was just about surviving day to day. Second year was about building systems that would let me survive indefinitely. After that, it became about finding purpose in the work itself. Pike noticed a worn photograph tucked behind a branch near one of the snares, a picture of Frank and a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, both of them younger, and radiating the quiet happiness of a couple secure in their love. "Mary?" Pike asked. Frank nodded, carefully adjusting the photograph's position to protect it from moisture. "I carry pictures of her to different places around my territory. Sounds crazy, I know, but it helps me feel like she's still part of my daily life instead of just a memory I visit." Pike didn't think it sounded crazy at all. He'd done similar things after his wife died, finding ways to include her presence in routines that had once been shared. The difference was that Pike's efforts had eventually felt hollow, forcing him to put away photographs and mementos to avoid the pain of constant reminding. "Do you ever think about going back?" Pike asked as they continued their circuit of Frank's snares. "To regular life, I mean." Frank was quiet for several steps, gathering deadwood suitable for burning. "I think about it sometimes. Wonder what it would be like to have conversations with people again, to use my carpentry skills for something besides survival, to be part of a community instead of just observing it from a distance." "What stops you?" "Fear, mostly." Frank's honesty was characteristically direct. "Fear that I wouldn't be able to handle the complexity of social relationships again, that I'd disappoint people who tried to help me, that I'd just be trading one kind of isolation for another." Pike understood that fear. After his divorce, he'd avoided serious relationships, partly because the prospect of being vulnerable with another person felt overwhelming. It was easier to remain emotionally distant than risk the pain of connection and potential loss. "Also," Frank continued, "I'm not sure what I'd have to offer. Most of the skills I've developed out here aren't transferable to regular employment. Who needs an expert at reading animal tracks or predicting weather from cloud formations?" Pike found himself thinking about Frank's problem-solving abilities, his resourcefulness, his capacity for patient planning and careful execution. Those were valuable skills in any context, though Frank might not recognize their broader applications. "You'd be surprised," Pike said. "Crisis management, resource allocation, long-term planning, those are skills every business needs. You've just been applying them in a different environment." Frank gathered an armload of firewood, testing each piece for dryness and proper burning characteristics. "Maybe, but there's also the question of whether I want to go back. This life has given me things I didn't expect. Peace, self-reliance, a kind of spiritual connection to the natural world that I never had when I was caught up in the rush of civilian life." As they returned toward the shelter, Pike noticed details of Frank's wilderness adaptation that he'd missed earlier. Subtle trail markers that would guide him back to camp in poor visibility. strategic placement of emergency supplies in case the main shelter became compromised. Evidence of long-term thinking and careful preparation that spoke to someone who'd found genuine satisfaction in the challenges of wilderness living. It's not just survival for you anymore, Pike realized. It's become a calling. Something like that, Frank agreed. I've learned to find dignity in simple things, keeping a good fire, providing clean water, building shelter that protects against the weather. There's satisfaction in work that directly sustains your life, without layers of bureaucracy or artificial complexity. Pike thought about his own work, the endless paperwork and procedural requirements that often seemed to create distance between officers and the people they served. There was something appealing about Frank's direct relationship between effort and result, skill and survival. They reached the shelter as snow began falling again, heavy flakes that would soon accumulate into another significant layer. Frank had timed their expedition perfectly, completing necessary tasks during the brief window of decent weather. Inside the warm shelter, Pike found himself looking at Frank's living space with new appreciation. Every item had multiple purposes. Every system was designed for efficiency and reliability. It was like stepping into the workshop of a master craftsman who'd spent years perfecting his tools and techniques. "You know what's strange?" Pike said, as Frank prepared their evening. "Meal, I came out here thinking I was going to rescue you from this crashed car situation. But I think you might be rescuing me from something else entirely." Frank looked up from the pot of stew he was stirring. "How do you mean?" "I've been sleepwalking through my life for years, using work to avoid dealing with everything else. Watching you out here, seeing how you've built something meaningful from nothing, it makes me wonder what I've been doing with all the advantages I've had." Frank tasted the stew and added a pinch of dried herbs from a small container. "We all find our own way of dealing with loss and disappointment. You use structure and authority to create meaning. I use solitude and self-reliance. Neither approach is right or wrong, just different responses to the same basic human need for purpose." Pike realized that Frank's perspective on their respective survival strategies was more generous than his own self-assessment. While Pike had been judging himself harshly for emotional avoidance, Frank saw it as a legitimate coping mechanism that had served its purpose during difficult times. "The question," Frank continued, "is whether the strategy you chose is still serving you, or whether it's time to try something different." Outside, the wind picked up again, reminding them both that they remained at the mercy of forces beyond their control. But inside the shelter, warmed by Frank's fire and sustained by his careful provisioning, Pike felt safer than he had in months, not just physically, but emotionally, in the presence of someone who'd faced his worst fears and emerged with wisdom, instead of bitterness. The third morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the snow-covered forest look like a postcard. Frank woke early to check the weather radio and assess their situation, while Pike slept more soundly than he had since the accident, his body finally relaxing into recovery. Frank stepped outside to evaluate snow conditions and check for signs that rescue might be possible. The storm had deposited nearly 4 feet of snow in some areas, sculpted by wind into drifts that would challenge even experienced winter travelers. The main road would likely remain impassable for several more days. He was returning to the shelter when he noticed something glinting in the snow near where he'd cached supplies retrieved from Pike's patrol car. Brushing away powder, Frank uncovered Pike's equipment bag, partially buried by wind-driven snow. Most of the contents were standard police gear, flashlight, emergency flares, basic first aid supplies. But nestled at the bottom was a manila envelope marked "Personal." Frank hesitated, respecting Pike's privacy even in their isolated circumstances. But the envelope had torn open during the crash, revealing a letter that bore the unmistakable characteristics of personal correspondence. Handwritten address, carefully formed letters, the kind of attention to detail that suggested someone had taken time to make the communication special. The return address read Rebecca Pike with a Denver address. Frank recognized the name from Pike's brief mention of an estranged daughter, the family relationship that had deteriorated like his own marriage under the pressure of law enforcement work. Frank carried the envelope back to the shelter, where Pike was sitting up and testing the mobility of his injured wrist. "Found this in your gear," Frank said, placing the envelope on the small table between them. "Looks like personal mail." Pike's reaction was immediate and complex. Recognition, pain, and something that might have been hope flickering across his features before being suppressed by practiced emotional control. He reached for the letter with his uninjured hand, then stopped without touching it. "From my daughter," Pike said simply. "Rebecca. She's 26 now, lives in Denver, works as a graphic designer. You haven't opened it?" Pike shook his head, staring at the envelope as if it might explode. "Came 3 weeks ago. I've been carrying it in my patrol car, thinking I'd read it when I was ready. Keep finding reasons to put it off." Frank recognized the particular kind of fear that surrounded important communications with estranged family members. The terror that opening the letter might confirm your worst fears about how completely you'd failed someone you loved. "What are you afraid it says?" Frank asked gently. "That she hates me, that she never wants to see me again, that I destroyed any chance of having a relationship with her through years of putting work ahead of family." Pike's voice carried the weight of guilt that had been accumulating for years. "Or maybe worse, that she doesn't feel anything about me at all anymore, that I've become irrelevant to her life." Frank understood the paralysis that came with that kind of fear. After Mary's death, he'd avoided calling his brother for months, terrified that reaching out would confirm his suspicion that he'd become a burden, someone to be pitied rather than welcomed. "She took the time to write a letter," Frank pointed out. "In an age of texts and emails, that suggests the communication matters to her." Pike picked up the envelope, feeling its weight and thickness. Rebecca was always thoughtful that way. Even as a kid, she'd make handmade birthday cards instead of buying them, spend hours on thank-you notes for Christmas presents. Her mother used to say she got her attention to detail from me back when that was still considered a compliment. "What happened between you two?" Pike leaned back in his chair, the letter still unopened in his hands. "Typical cop family story. I missed school plays for court appearances, skipped family dinners for overtime shifts, spent weekends working extra details instead of coaching her soccer team. Always promised I'd make it up to her later when the case was closed or the department was fully staffed or the emergency was resolved." Frank had heard variations of this story from other law enforcement families, the gradual erosion of relationships under the constant pressure of a job that demanded everything and gave back mostly. Frustration and cynicism. "When did you realize you'd lost her?" "Her 18th birthday. I'd promised to take her to dinner, just the two of us, celebrate her becoming an adult. Got called out on a domestic violence situation that turned into a 3-hour ordeal. By the time I finished the paperwork and got home, she was gone. Left for college early. Didn't even say goodbye." Pike opened the envelope with careful precision, unfolding several pages of Rebecca's neat handwriting. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and Frank watched his expression shift from apprehension to surprise, to something that might have been relief. "She's getting married," Pike said quietly. "Next month, to a man named David who sounds—" He paused, reading more. "She says he reminds her of me in good ways. Steady, loyal, someone who keeps his promises." Frank waited while Pike continued reading, recognizing the mixture of emotions playing across the officer's face. Joy at his daughter's happiness, pain at being excluded from the celebration, regret for all the missed opportunities that had led to this estrangement. "She wants to see me," Pike said, looking up from the letter with wonder. "Not for the wedding. Too late for that, and she doesn't want to risk the awkwardness affecting her special day. But after. She says she's been thinking about family, about what kind of mother she wants to be someday, about whether it's possible to repair relationships that have been broken for a long time. Frank felt a surge of genuine happiness for Pike, recognizing the gift of unexpected grace that came with family reconciliation. "That's remarkable. She says she doesn't blame me for the divorce, understands that police work is hard on families, knows that I was trying to provide for us even when my methods were misguided." Pike's voice caught slightly. "She says she missed having a father at her graduation, missed being able to call me when she had car trouble or needed advice about work, missed sharing good news with someone who'd be proud of her accomplishments." Pike folded the letter carefully, treating it like the precious thing it was. "She also says she's learned enough about life to understand that people make mistakes, that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and that everyone deserves a chance to try again if they're willing to do the work." Frank thought about his own estranged family relationships. The brother in Denver he'd never called, the cousin in Seattle who'd stopped sending Christmas cards after Frank failed to respond for 3 consecutive years. Rebecca's letter represented the kind of grace Frank had convinced himself he didn't deserve. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked. "I don't know," Pike admitted. "Part of me wants to call her immediately, arrange to meet as soon as I get back to civilization, but another part is terrified that I'll mess it up again, say the wrong thing, disappoint her when she's giving me this incredible opportunity." Frank recognized the fear of squandering a second chance, the paralyzing awareness that some opportunities only came once. But he also understood that fear could become its own form of self-sabotage, preventing action that might lead to healing. "You know what I learned out here?" Frank said. "Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Waiting for the ideal moment, the perfect words, the guarantee of success, that's just another way of choosing inaction. Sometimes the best thing you can do is show up imperfectly and work from there." Pike looked at Frank with growing respect, recognizing wisdom earned through hard experience. "Is that what you'd do if you had a chance to reconnect with your family?" Frank considered the question honestly, thinking about the phone calls he'd avoided, the relationships he'd let atrophy through neglect and shame. "I'd try to remember that the people who love us usually want the relationship to work, even when we've made mistakes. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for effort, for genuine care, for evidence that the relationship matters. To us too." Pike nodded slowly, understanding that Frank was offering more than advice. He was sharing hard-won insight about the cost of pride and the value of vulnerability. The 4th day brought ominous changes to Pike's condition that sent Frank into high alert. What had seemed like a manageable concussion with improving symptoms suddenly reversed course, leaving Pike dizzy, nauseous, and struggling with coordination that had been steadily improving. Frank watched Pike attempt to stand and immediately steady himself against the shelter wall, his face pale with more than just the morning cold. "Talk to me about how you're feeling," Frank said, moving to provide support without making Pike feel helpless. "Headaches worse than yesterday," Pike admitted, allowing Frank to guide him back to the chair. "And everything seems, I don't know, off balance, like the world is tilting in directions it shouldn't." Frank pulled out a small flashlight and checked Pike's pupil response, noting the slight inequality that hadn't been present the day before. "Any vomiting, double vision, trouble remembering things?" "Some nausea. Vision seems okay, but I'm having trouble concentrating. Feel like I'm thinking through fog." Pike looked at Frank with growing concern. "This isn't normal concussion recovery, is it?" Frank shook his head grimly. "Could be secondary swelling, increased intracranial pressure. Without proper medical imaging, I can't tell how serious it is, but delayed neurological symptoms after head trauma. That's not something we can treat out here." The weather radio confirmed Frank's growing anxiety about their situation. Another storm system was moving in, promising to dump additional snow on roads that were just beginning to become passable. If they didn't get Pike to medical attention soon, it might be another week before rescue was possible. Frank pulled his father's old brass compass from the toolbox, a reliable instrument that had guided him through countless wilderness expeditions over the years. The compass had belonged to his father, a forest ranger who taught Frank to read terrain and weather, to navigate by landmarks and natural signs when technology failed. "I need to get you out of here," Frank said, studying topographic maps he'd memorized during his years in the wilderness. "There's a ranger station about 8 miles south, staffed year-round for winter emergencies. If I can get you there, they'll have radio communication and medical supplies." Pike looked at Frank with alarm. 8 miles through 4 feet of snow, carrying someone with a head injury? That's not a rescue mission, that's suicide. "Maybe," Frank agreed, "but the alternative is staying here and hoping your condition doesn't deteriorate further while we wait for rescue that might not come in time. I've done winter travel before in Afghanistan and here in Montana. It's dangerous, but it's not impossible." Frank began gathering supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd planned for emergency scenarios. Extra clothing, emergency, food, first aid supplies, flares from Pike's patrol car, and improvised tools that might mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. "You don't understand," Pike protested. "I can barely walk from the chair to the bed without losing my balance. How am I supposed to travel 8 miles through wilderness?" "I'll carry you," Frank said simply, testing the weight distribution of a makeshift backpack. "Build a travois, or use a fireman's carry when the terrain allows it. You focus on staying conscious and alert. I'll handle the navigation and transport." Pike stared at Frank with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You're talking about risking your life for someone who arrested you, who treated you like a criminal, who represents a system that failed you completely." Frank paused in his preparations, meeting Pike's eyes directly. "I'm talking about doing what needs to be done to save someone's life. The rest of that history, it doesn't matter right now. It matters to me," Pike said quietly. "Frank, if something happens to you out there because you were trying to help me, then I'll have died doing something worthwhile," Frank interrupted. "After 11 years of just surviving, maybe it's time to live for something bigger than myself." Frank's compass pointed steadily south, its needle unwavering despite the magnetic anomalies common in mountainous terrain. The instrument represented generations of reliable guidance, his father's gift of practical wisdom that had seen Frank through military service and wilderness survival. "There's something else," Frank continued, "organizing medical supplies for easy access during travel. Your daughter's letter, that's your chance to build something good from all the mistakes you've made. But only if you're alive to take advantage of it." Pike absorbed this truth, recognizing that Frank was offering more than medical rescue. He was providing the opportunity for Pike to become the father Rebecca deserved, to honor her willingness, to rebuild their relationship by proving that her faith wasn't misplaced. "What if we both die out there?" Pike asked. "Then we die trying to do the right thing, instead of dying while doing nothing," Frank replied. "I've spent 11 years learning to accept things I couldn't change. This is something I can change, and I'm not going to waste the opportunity." Frank tested the integrity of a makeshift sled, constructed from pine branches and salvaged materials, designed to distribute Pike's weight across snow surfaces while remaining maneuverable through forest terrain. Every element of his preparation demonstrated years of problem-solving experience adapted to life-or-death circumstances. "Why?" Pike asked. "Why risk everything for someone who's never done anything for you?" Frank considered the question while checking his emergency supplies one final time. "Because 11 years ago, I was dying inside, and I thought the answer was to disappear from the world completely. I've learned to find peace in solitude, but I've also learned that peace without purpose is just another kind of death. And your purpose? You're an opportunity to prove that Frank Delaney still has something valuable to offer the world, that all these years of survival weren't just about hiding from life, but about preparing for a moment when my skills could make a real difference." Frank loaded Pike's letter from Rebecca into a waterproof container, ensuring it would survive whatever hardships the journey might bring. The letter represented hope for both men, Pike's chance at family reconciliation, and Frank's reminder, that relationships could be repaired when both people were willing to do the work. "The storm's moving in faster than predicted," Frank said, checking weather updates on the radio. "We need to leave within the hour if we're going to reach the ranger station before conditions become impossible." Pike nodded, understanding that further delay would only increase the risks for both of them. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay conscious, stay warm, and trust me to get us where we need to go." Frank helped Pike into layers of protective clothing, checking each item to ensure it would provide adequate insulation during the grueling journey ahead. "If you start feeling confused or disoriented, tell me immediately. Brain injuries can be unpredictable, and I need to know if your condition changes." Frank secured his father's compass in an accessible pocket, along with emergency flares that might serve as signals for rescue aircraft if weather conditions improved. Every item was chosen for multiple potential uses, reflecting hard-learned lessons about resource management in survival situations. "Frank," Pike said as they prepared to leave the shelter that had protected them for 4 days, "I want you to know, whatever happens out there, this has been the most important conversation I've had in years. You've shown me things about myself and about life that I needed to see." Frank nodded acknowledgement, understanding that Pike was preparing for the possibility that one or both of them might not survive the journey. "Same here. You've reminded me that people can change, that second chances are worth fighting for, and that isolation doesn't have to mean permanent exile from human connection." They stepped out into the bitter morning air, Frank carrying Pike's weight with practiced efficiency while navigating through snow that reached nearly to his waist in places. Behind them, the shelter that had saved Pike's life stood ready to protect other travelers who might need refuge from the mountain's harsh weather. Ahead lay 8 miles of treacherous wilderness travel, a journey that would test every survival skill Frank had developed during his years of exile. But for the first time since Mary's death, Frank felt that his life had clear purpose beyond mere survival. He was racing against time and weather to save a man who represented the possibility of redemption for both of them. The first 2 miles tested every assumption Frank had made about winter wilderness travel with an injured companion. Pike's weight on the improvised sled created constant drag that multiplied the effort required for each step, while navigating around fallen trees and rocky outcroppings demanded route adjustments that added precious time to their journey. Frank had estimated 4 hours to reach the ranger station under ideal conditions. Now fighting through snow that varied from knee-deep to waist-deep depending on wind patterns and terrain, he realized they would be fortunate to make the distance before nightfall, if they made it at all. Pike drifted in and out of coherent conversation, his neurological symptoms worsening with the stress and cold of travel. "Mary would have liked this," he mumbled during one lucid moment, gesturing weakly at the pristine winter landscape surrounding them. The snow on the pine branches, the way the light hits the mountains. Frank adjusted Pike's position on the sled, ensuring his injured companion remained as warm and comfortable as possible despite the brutal traveling conditions. "She loved winter camping," Frank agreed, using conversation to monitor Pike's mental state. "Used to say that snow made everything quiet enough to hear your own thoughts clearly. Smart woman." Pike's words were slightly slurred, a worrying development that Frank noted without comment. "Rebecca's mother was like that too. Saw beauty in things I was always too busy to notice." The mention of Pike's daughter brought focus to both men, reminding them why this journey mattered beyond mere survival. Rebecca's letter represented the possibility of healing relationships that both men had thought permanently damaged, but only if Pike lived to take advantage of the opportunity she offered. Frank pulled Pike and the sled up a steep incline, using rope and careful leverage to navigate terrain that would have been challenging even without the burden of an injured companion. His lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and sweat froze on his face despite the sub-zero temperatures, but he maintained steady progress through pure determination. The emergency flare in Frank's pocket represented their only hope of signaling for help if the situation became desperate. Pike's patrol car flares were designed for roadside emergencies, not wilderness rescue, but they might be visible to search aircraft if weather conditions improved enough to allow flight operations. "How much farther?" Pike asked during a brief rest stop, his voice weaker than it had been even an hour earlier. Frank consulted his compass and estimated their progress against known landmarks. "About 6 miles. We're making good time considering the conditions." It was a lie designed to maintain Pike's morale, and they both knew it. Their actual progress was disappointingly slow, hampered by terrain that forced lengthy detours and snow conditions that made each step a battle against exhaustion. Pike understood the reality of their situation without needing frank assessment. "If you have to choose between getting yourself to safety and trying to save me, I'm not having that conversation," Frank interrupted firmly. "We started this journey together, and we're finishing it together." The wind picked up as afternoon. Shadows lengthened, carrying the scent of approaching snow and the promise of weather that would make their current challenges seem trivial. Frank had experienced enough mountain storms to recognize the signs of a serious system moving in, one that could drop visibility to 0 and make navigation impossible even with a compass. Pike's breathing became more labored as the day progressed, his responses to Frank's questions increasingly delayed and confused. The head injury was clearly worsening, creating pressure that no amount of wilderness medicine could address. Only proper medical facilities could provide the intervention Pike needed to survive. Frank adjusted his grip on the sled ropes, redistributing weight to protect his hands from frostbite while maintaining forward momentum. Every step required conscious decision-making about route selection, energy conservation, and risk assessment. One mistake could doom them both. "Talk to me about Rebecca," Frank said, using conversation to keep Pike alert and engaged. "What was she like as a little girl?" Pike's response came slowly, requiring visible effort to organize his thoughts. Curious about everything, always asking questions, taking things apart to see how they worked. Drive her mother crazy because she'd rather build with Lincoln logs than play with dolls. Sounds like she got your analytical mind and her mother's creativity. Best of both worlds, until the divorce split those worlds apart. Pike's regret was palpable, a grief that had deepened over years of missed opportunities. "I used to think work was how I showed love, providing security, being reliable, making sure the family was safe. Turns out, presence matters more than protection." Frank understood the mistake Pike described, having made similar errors in his own marriage. The irony was that both men had possessed the capacity for deep connection, but had channeled their caring into external achievements rather than direct emotional engagement. The sound of aircraft engines cut through the mountain silence, causing both men to look skyward with desperate hope. A search helicopter appeared briefly through the cloud cover before disappearing again, too distant to spot two figures struggling through the wilderness below. Frank reached for the emergency flare, then hesitated. Firing it now might waste their only signal device if the aircraft couldn't see them clearly enough to respond. But waiting for a better opportunity meant gambling that another chance would come before Pike's condition deteriorated beyond help. Frank made the decision with the cold clarity of someone who understood that hesitation could mean death. He pulled the emergency flare from his pocket, aimed it toward the helicopter's last known position, and fired. The brilliant red light streaked across the grey sky like a prayer made visible, burning bright against the winter landscape. The helicopter banked sharply, its pilot responding immediately to the distress signal. Frank waved frantically with both arms, making himself as visible as possible against the snow while the aircraft circled to locate the source of the flare. Pike lay motionless on the sled, his breathing shallow but steady, consciousness fading, in and out like a radio signal reaching the edge of its range. "Stay with me," Frank urged, kneeling beside Pike as the helicopter searched for a safe landing zone. Help is coming. You're going to see Rebecca again, going to have that conversation you've been avoiding. Pike's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Frank with effort. Thank you, he whispered, the words barely audible over the approaching rotor. Noise. For everything. The rescue helicopter touched down in a small clearing, about 50 yards from their position, its rotors whipping snow into blinding clouds. Frank shielded Pike from the worst of the downdraft, while emergency medical technicians approached with a proper rescue litter and advanced medical equipment. Patient is a police officer, injured in vehicle accident 4 days ago, Frank shouted, over the engine noise, providing essential medical history as the EMTs took over Pike's care. Concussion with delayed neurological symptoms, confusion, nausea, balance problems that worsened significantly today. The lead EMT, a woman in her 30s with the calm competence of extensive emergency experience, quickly assessed Pike's condition while her partner prepared him for transport. You did good work keeping him stable, she told Frank. Delayed brain swelling can be fatal without proper intervention. Frank watched them load Pike into the helicopter, noting the professional efficiency that represented everything his wilderness. Medicine couldn't provide, cardiac monitors, IV fluids, medications that could reduce intracranial pressure and prevent further neurological damage. Are you coming with us? The EMT asked Frank, noting his obvious exhaustion and signs of cold exposure. Frank looked at the helicopter, then back at the wilderness that had been his home for 11 years. The prospect of returning to civilization felt almost as overwhelming as Pike's medical emergency, requiring a different kind of courage than wilderness survival. Yes, Frank said, surprising himself with the certainty of his decision. I'm coming. The flight to Glacier Falls Regional Hospital took 20 minutes, covering terrain that would have required 2 days of winter travel on foot. Frank sat beside Pike's stretcher, watching monitors that tracked vital signs he couldn't interpret, but understanding that Pike's survival now depended on medical intervention far beyond anything wilderness skills could provide. Pike regained consciousness as they approached the hospital, his eyes seeking Frank's face with recognition and gratitude. Did we make it? We made it, Frank confirmed, squeezing Pike's hand. You're going to be fine. The hospital emergency department received them with practiced efficiency, whisking Pike away for CT scans and neurological evaluation, while Frank found himself alone in a waiting room that felt surreal after days of wilderness isolation. Fluorescent lights, vinyl chairs, the constant bustle of people dealing with medical crises. It was like stepping into an alien world. A nurse brought Frank coffee and a blanket, noting his obvious hypothermia and exhaustion. The doctor will want to examine you too, she said kindly. Exposure and dehydration can be serious, even when you don't realize it. Frank accepted the medical attention with bemused cooperation, submitting to tests and examinations while his mind struggled to process the transition from life-or-death wilderness survival to the sterile safety of modern medicine. The hospital bracelet they placed on his wrist felt strange, a plastic identifier that assigned him patient status in an institution designed to heal rather than judge. Hours later, after Pike's emergency surgery to relieve brain swelling had been declared successful, Frank sat beside his hospital bed watching the steady rise and fall of breathing that represented life preserved against significant odds. The surgeon says you'll make a complete recovery, Frank told Pike when he woke from anesthesia. No permanent neurological damage, full function expected within a few weeks. Pike nodded weakly, still groggy from medication, but alert enough to understand the magnitude of what Frank had accomplished. The ranger station. How far did we actually travel? Frank smiled, recognizing Pike's need to understand the scope of their shared ordeal. About 6 miles. We were still 2 miles short when the helicopter found us. You saved my life. We saved each other, Frank corrected. You reminded me that isolation doesn't have to be permanent, that connection with other people is worth the risk of being hurt or disappointed. Pike reached for Frank's hand with surprising strength, his grip conveying gratitude that words couldn't adequately express. What happens now? Frank looked out the hospital window at the town of Glacier Falls, visible in the distance like a collection of possibilities he'd abandoned 11 years ago. Now we figure out how to live with what we've learned about ourselves and each other. 6 months later, Frank Delaney walked through Glacier Falls Memorial Park with the measured pace of a man who'd learned to appreciate simple pleasures. His job as head groundskeeper suited him perfectly. Outdoor work that required both physical skill and careful planning, responsibility that mattered to the community, and the satisfaction of maintaining something beautiful for others to enjoy. Small apartment above Murphy's Hardware had become home in ways Frank hadn't expected. Mrs. Murphy, the owner's widow, had offered him the space after hearing about his role in Pike's rescue, and Frank had furnished it with pieces he'd built himself during evening hours when solitude felt comfortable rather than necessary. A simple brass key hung from a hook beside his door, the key to his own place, representing stability and belonging that Frank had thought permanently lost. The key had weight beyond its practical function, symbolizing a community's willingness to welcome someone back from exile when he proved worthy of trust. Pike met him every Thursday morning at the diner on Main Street, a tradition that had developed naturally during Pike's recovery period and continued as both men discovered the value of their friendship. Their weekly conversations had become something both looked forward to, a chance to process the changes in their lives and maintain the connection forged during their wilderness ordeal. "Rebecca called last night," Pike said as Frank settled into the booth they'd claimed as their own. "She and David are expecting their first child." Frank felt genuine happiness for Pike, knowing how much his relationship with his daughter meant to him. "That's wonderful news. How are you feeling about becoming a grandfather?" "Terrified and thrilled in equal measure," Pike admitted. "Rebecca asked if I'd be willing to visit when the baby's born, maybe help out during the first few weeks. She says David wants to meet the father she's been telling him about." The reconciliation between Pike and his daughter had progressed slowly, but steadily, built on honest communication and mutual willingness to work through years of accumulated hurt. Frank had encouraged Pike through the difficult conversations, drawing on his own hard-won wisdom about the importance of showing up imperfectly rather than waiting for perfect circumstances. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd be honored to help. In whatever way I can. But only if she's sure she wants me there. I don't want to intrude on such an important time." Pike stirred sugar into his coffee with the careful attention he brought to all decisions now. She laughed and said that's exactly the kind of consideration she'd hoped for from me. Frank had watched Pike transform from a rigid, emotionally distant officer into someone capable of vulnerability and genuine connection. The change hadn't been dramatic. Pike remained disciplined and professional, but his approach to relationships had softened, informed by his understanding of how quickly life could change and how precious human connection really was. "What about your policing?" Frank asked. "How's the new community outreach program working?" Pike's face lit up with enthusiasm for work that had regained meaning and purpose. "Better than I hoped. We've connected 12 people with social services, found housing for 6 families, and established regular communication with the homeless community. Turns out, when you approach people with curiosity instead of judgment, they're usually willing to work with you." Frank knew that Pike's experience with him had fundamentally changed his approach to law enforcement, shifting from processing problems to understanding people. Pike had become an advocate for treating homelessness as a community issue requiring compassionate solutions rather than a law enforcement problem requiring arrests. "Speaking of community connections," Pike continued, "the youth group leaders have been asking when you're going to start those wilderness survival classes we discussed." Frank smiled, recognizing Pike's gentle pressure to expand his community. Involvement. Frank had been teaching informal survival skills to local teenagers, sharing knowledge that had kept him alive for 11 years. The young people were eager students, appreciating both the practical skills and Frank's patient teaching style. "Next month," Frank said, "I've been working on a curriculum that covers basic wilderness safety, navigation, emergency preparedness, skills." every mountain community resident should have. Frank had written a comprehensive wilderness survival manual during his evening hours, organizing 11 years of hard-earned knowledge into lessons that could help others avoid the mistakes he'd made and benefit from the techniques he'd developed. The manual would become the foundation for classes that turned survival knowledge into community service. The mayor mentioned wanting to formalize the program, Pike said. Make it part of the county's emergency preparedness initiative, maybe. Get some grant funding to expand it to other mountain communities. Frank considered this possibility with the same careful evaluation he brought to all major decisions. Recognition and official support would mean increased visibility, more students, and the opportunity to help a broader range of people develop skills that could save their lives in emergencies. That might be good, Frank agreed, though I want to make sure the program stays focused on practical skills and personal responsibility, not just entertainment or adventure tourism. They finished breakfast and walked together toward the park, where Frank would spend his day maintaining trails and facilities that served thousands of visitors each year. Pike would return to the police station, where his shift would likely include community outreach visits that had become the most rewarding part of his job. Same time next week? Pike asked as they prepared to part ways. Wouldn't miss it, Frank replied, meaning it completely. Frank watched Pike walk away, noting the officer's relaxed posture and confident stride, signs of someone who'd found peace with his choices and optimism about his future. Their friendship had become one of the most meaningful relationships in both their lives, proof that shared hardship could create bonds stronger than shared advantages. Frank pulled his grandfather's compass from his pocket, checking the direction toward the park's maintenance facility where his day's work waited. The compass needle pointed steadily north, as reliable as ever, but Frank no longer needed its guidance for navigation. He'd found his direction through human connection and community service, discovering that the most important journeys were measured not in miles traveled, but in lives touched and relationships restored. As he walked through the park, he maintained with such care, Frank reflected on the strange path that had led him from exile to belonging, from survival to service, from bitter isolation to friendship that enriched every day. The wilderness had taught him to depend on himself, but returning to civilization had taught him something equally valuable, that independence and interdependence weren't opposites, but complementary aspects of a life lived with both courage and compassion.